Okay. Jim, yes, excellent.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming out on this last day of this terrific series we've had with Dr. Echerd. So we're just really happy to see all of you. I'll start out asking, are there any joys or concerns today? Has anyone heard from Flem and Judy? To know how she's doing, or they both are doing? We'll have to check on them. Last night, and now they're not even on here, so I hope. Oh, right, right. We need to, right. Well, we need to sort of follow up with them as well and hope that they're okay. Martha and Jim. Excuse me. We haven't been passing the hat in here as we usually do. I know we have different classes in here with us, but I'm going to let Lindy is going to take care of that today. We're going to do a little catching up. Because for our class, we have some expenses coming up. So Lindy.
Good morning. I'm literally passing the plate because I didn't want to go upstairs and get a basket out of our Sunday school class. But we collected funds the first week for room in the inn, and then we haven't passed it since then. And then also we have the youth auction coming up. And last year we just wrote them a check for $100. And so I don't know if we want to do that same amount again, or if we want to increase it, but I'll have them put something in the email this week about it. But for this time, I'm just going to pass the class. This is for ages and stages, but everyone's welcome to put money in our pie. Feel free to fill the plate.
We promise it will go to a good cause, a good causes at any rate. Right, give early and often. So, okay, so joys and concerns. Does anyone know what our program is next week? Lassie. Oh, okay, Cheryl. Okay, Brian. So Cheryl Baird is in, Cheryl and Jim. Oh, okay. Cheryl is March, Cheryl and Jim. But next week it's Brian will be with us. Okay, so we've got that out of the way. Okay, well, we're happy to have everybody coming in here. If there's nothing else, we're going to turn this over for the last session. Oh, yes.
The chili cook-off is next Sunday after the 10:30 service. And I think I'm the only one in our class putting chili in. But the way you win this year is who has the most money in their bucket. So I'm looking forward to winning.
So at least Ann Brown in our class is making chili. So up, I hear this.
The donations go to the food ministries at Calvary. Normally we do on Super Bowl Sunday when the youth are standing at the doors with soup pots to collect the funds. This year we're going to do it as a lunch and chili cook-off and fundraiser. So it's the same as Super Bowl Sunday, just a week earlier.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, so we have that, and then I just might mention a little plug for Dr. Echerd. There's a series, the Harpeth Hall Winterim for adults on Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. I don't know why I have such a hard time. It's like Huey, Dewey, and Louie. Why can't I keep three things in my head? But it's a lot. But anyway, those I'm sure you can still sign up if you're interested for that. Anyway, without taking any more time away from Dr. Echerd, we're just so happy. We've just been so happy to have you here. And thank you for being here for this fourth and time to wrap this up. Thank you so much.
My microphone, is it coming through? Okay, because I kept messing with it. And speaking of Winter for Adults, though, I have to tell you, I mean, I'd love for an email to come. I'm starting in February. I have 3 nights. So I'm going to talk about the Hamas and the Hezbollah and Houthis. But on this topic about Ukraine and Russia, there's a teacher at Harpeth Hall named Trevor Erlacher who's great, and his specialty is Ukraine, and he's doing, I think, 5 Thursday nights, starting this Thursday night. His will be for about an hour at Harpethal about just the story of Ukraine, and he'll be great if you're interested in that. So, contact the advancement office at Harpethal, or the alumni office rather. But I stopped with this picture because I remembered I was going to talk about Cossacks. And I'm going to try not to spend too much time talking just about the whole question of Ukrainian independence itself, which is a huge topic. And again, go hear Trevor Erlacher in Harpethal, because I want to talk mainly about the question of the church and the Patriarch of Moscow and so on. But you have to understand a little bit about, when did Ukraine emerge? Is Putin in any way correct when he says Ukraine is not a country, has never been a country, it's just part of sort of the greater Russian world? Some of it has to do with these people. And I think all of you have heard of Cossacks. If you've ever seen a traditional mounting of the Nutcracker, Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker, that ballet, the dance of the Cossacks who jumping over each other, leapfrogging and so on. What a Cossack was, or is, there are still people who kind of maintain those traditions. There were people who lived on the borders of the Russian state, particularly in the south and to the east. I'll show you one map of the most important ones for the story of Ukraine, the Zaporozhian host, as it was called. But they lived in areas that were frontier areas, sort of dangerous areas, and the Cossack lifestyle is kind of like American cowboys. It's based on the horse, also based on a lot of violence, but also this sense of kind of freedom and individualism. And the Cossack areas generally did not have serfdom, which is most of the Russian world eventually did. But the Tsar, for example, tended to let those areas have this kind of freedom in terms of not having serfdom, which is why some people would run away from serfdom to the Cossack areas. And Cossacks are ethnically mainly Russian. They're not a separate ethnic group. They are generally Russian Orthodox Christians. But they also picked their own local leaders in a kind of rough democratic way, men called hetmen. So in Russian sort of mythology, they feature very prominent, kind of like cowboys do in the United States. The vast majority of Americans were never cowboys, but we certainly have a huge number of movies and used to, at least TV shows about them and so on, because they represent something about the American character, at least. But they lived, for example, not only in those operations, but they were the Don Cossacks that were over here. They were the ones that were over in the Urals. But they were given that kind of freedom in return for being like the border guards to some extent of the Russian state gradually. And they fought the enemies of Russian Orthodoxy, particularly. They fought Catholic Poles a great deal, particularly the Zaporozhians. They also fought the Ottoman Empire, which of course Muslim. They fought against the Tatar Khanates in the east, who were Muslim. They also, some Cossack bands were the ones who pushed Russia all the way across Siberia, just like we pushed west. They pushed east, and they often encountered some indigenous people, just like white settlers did in the west, but got all the way to the Pacific. So Cossacks figure really prominently in their history, but the darker side of them is not only they tended to not like Catholic Poles or Muslims of any sort, at least they fought them certainly, but also anti-Jewish. And some of the worst pogroms against Jews in the history of the Russian people were done by Cossacks. So there was that side of them too. But this is a famous painting. Oh, and by the way, I was asked to make the cursor a little bit larger. Can y'all see this better now? It was so tiny before. Yeah, okay. I enlarged them. But this is from, I think, about 1880. It's a painting about an event in the 1600s when the Zaporozhian Cossacks were told by the Ottoman Sultan. He sent a message to them saying, you need to submit to my authority. And they sent this letter back that was extremely insulting. And this is them composing the letter. You see, they're all laughing, of course, and they're all, saying, say this about his mother, say this about him. So, to Russians, it's, of course, something they revel in. But so you might have seen, since you're my age, the movie called Taras Bulba that had Tony Curtis in it and Yul Brynner. It was made in the early 1960s. It's based on a novel called The Cossack Chief by Nikolai Gogol. And it's historically really wrong in a lot of ways about the Cossacks. Certainly downplays the anti-Semitism. Tony Curtis plays the son of Yul Brynner, and Tony Curtis was actually a Jewish actor playing this Cossack. But anyway, you might want to check it out. But by the 1600s, the Zaporozhian hosts, as we call them there, particularly had to make a decision about, do we sort of submit to the authority of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which you can see was right next to the border, or to the rulers of Muscovy, what we would now call Russia, the czars up there. And ultimately, they didn't really want to be under anyone's authority. But since Muscovy was Orthodox Christian, and generally Cossacks were as well, they opted to do that. But a lot of it has to do with a guy, and that's the one of the coat of arms that Ukraine has had in its history. You can see there's a Cossack there on one side. That trident symbol you've seen around Nashville, probably people supporting Ukraine. The national flag of Ukraine does not have that emblem on it. It's just the blue and the gold. But the more formal flag with the coat of arms that most countries have, something like that, is this one. But there's a man on your list, if you have your list with you, about midway down on the second page, where it says Zaporozhian Cossacks. But a man whose name I've definitely asked Dr. Erlacher to help me pronounce it, and it's Bogdan Khmelnytsky. That's how you pronounce that. And that's him. He was the hetman, the leader of the Zaporozhian Cossacks. And he eventually led this revolt against particularly the Poles. The Poles were the villains in their minds, Polish Catholic landlords who supposedly were oppressing Orthodox Russian peasants and so on. But in this revolt, in the middle of the 1600s, there were also definitely pogroms. And when I've taught anti-Semitism in classes, I always talk about how in the mid-1600s, there were thousands of Jewish people that were slaughtered because, not just because they were not Orthodox Christians, but because the biggest Jewish population in the world, of course, as most of you know, was in that part of the world, was in what's now Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, basically. But Jewish people were often the middlemen between a Polish Catholic landlord and the Russian peasants that were working the lands. And so, because often the Jewish people were illiterate and almost no one else was. But, no one obviously likes the guy who goes around saying you haven't paid your rent. They also sometimes were pawnbrokers, diddling money. That's, of course, an anti-Semitic stereotype about Jews being usurious and everything. But to some extent, that was true because they weren't under the prohibition against charging interest. And so there are a lot of reasons why people have these resentments. Plus, they are the other. They were different in not being Orthodox Christians. But this is celebrating, of course, Bogdan Khmelnytsky coming into the city of Kiev, being blessed by the Metropolitan, the Orthodox leader of the church there. But one decision he made was to ally with the Tsar of Russia at that time. And he's not one of the really famous ones to Americans, but his name was Alexis or Alexei. He was a Romanov. He wasn't the very first one. I guess he was the second. Later, you'll have Peter the Great, that most people know about, and of course, the later Romanovs. But that's how the tie really begins. And, going back to this map, for a while, though, much of what's, today Ukraine was still inside this large Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, because there you can see Kiev, which is kind of the center of modern Ukraine there. So for a long time, the people that we now think of as Ukrainians were kind of split between Muscovy and Poland, and to some extent, an area that was trying to keep its independence. But to move along, the next picture there is in the late 1600s, you had the first really famous Romanov, and this is Peter the Great, Peter the First. He ruled in the late 1600s, early 1700s. And he's most important for trying to modernize Russia, which meant westernize Russia. And he's celebrated by Russians as extremely important in that sense. But it was controversial at the time. A lot of Russians did not think they needed to change. And particularly, they thought any change implied that Russia was not really the Third Rome, this idea I talked about last Sunday, the idea of Holy Mother Russia. Because although Peter does not try to make them Western Christians at all, but just anything that implied that Russia wasn't the best country on earth really bothered the average Russian. And so Peter was not popular among the average Russians. But he did do one thing about the church. He did something like Henry VIII did in England. Not quite so far, though, when Henry broke with the Catholic Church and makes England Protestant. But in terms of controlling the church administratively, they now had a patriarch in Moscow that even Constantinople agreed to that back in 1589. So they'd had one for about 100 years. But Peter, I think, thought that represented too much independence on the part of the Russian Orthodox Church. So he abolished the patriarchate, replaced it with a holy synod, with a kind of a council to govern, the church in Russia. And that's the way it was down until the 20th century. So in the, most of the 18th century, 19th century, you did not have a Patriarch of Moscow. And that council was generally appointed by whoever was czar. So just like Henry VIII, of course, made himself head of the Church of England. Peter, in a sense, did the same thing. The church itself didn't change in terms of its worship and liturgy and theology the way that Anglican Church did in England. But this is a famous painting of Peter in this green military uniform. And then I have to show you this. This was going to be one of the possible covers when Putin was Times Man of the Year in 2007, I think it was 6 or 7. They thought about doing this one. I wish they had. I've seen there's several variations on what they end up with, but they end up with just a photograph of him kind of staring right out at you. But certainly this is not just a parody. I mean, well, it is a parody, but Putin has expressed a great deal of admiration for Peter the Great because he was such a strong autocratic ruler. He was definitely not in any way a liberalizer. He was a modernizer, but yes. Okay, she was married to a man who was Peter the Third. Oh, yes. Okay. I was asked who was Catherine the Great's wife, husband. Yeah, Catherine the Great rules in the last third of the 1700s. So she's a generation after Peter the Great. She was purely German. Her name was Sophia. She was a German Lutheran from a tiny little German principality, but she became Orthodox, changed her name to Katharina. But she was married to the Roman Affair, who ruled for about a year, and he's Peter the Third. But then she, had this coup and knocked him off, and almost certainly had him killed.
She thought he was crazy anyway. She wanted to get rid of him.
And yeah, he was a disgusting person by almost any stretch. Oh yeah, she deserves the title of the Great. If great means influential and changing things. No, I was at a conference about teaching women's history years ago, and they were asking us, it's just a thought process, who's the most influential woman in history? And I said, I think you might argue it's Catherine the Great. I mean, she's ruling the largest country in the world. She made it larger, also. But you certainly didn't want to be married to her. But yeah, her story, of course, she's fascinating for all kinds of reasons. But that's Peter the Third. Yeah, okay. And speaking of Catherine, though, this is something that's extremely important that happens in terms of the question of Russia and Ukraine and so on. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, we'll just call it Poland, was large, but it was weak because it had a very weak monarchy. The Polish monarchy was elected by the Diet of Poland, and the Diet was made up purely of nobles. And the Polish nobles deliberately elected, starting in the late 1600s at least, elected weak people, or above all, foreigners. And they wouldn't elect someone from the same family each time. So you had no continuity. So the monarchy, there was really no national army, no national tax system, because of course what that meant was if the king is weak, the nobles are powerful. The Polish nobles were like kings on their own estates. But they ultimately were signing the death warrant of Poland by making their monarchy so weak, because in the late 1700s, the three powerful absolute centralized monarchies around them, which was Russia, Austria, and Prussia, began to carve Poland up. And they didn't really have to even fight a war. The first partition, as it says, is 1772, and Catherine the Great was part of it, which is the Russian ruler. Frederick the Great of Prussia was involved. He's the one who first instigated all this. And then the Austrian Empire under Maria Theresa, another interesting female ruler. They told Poland, we're taking slices of your territory, and Poland could not even fight back. So the first partition, each of those three countries, the Russians took that, you can see Austria got this and so on. There was another two partitions in the 1790s, one of which Austria did not participate in. But finally, in the third partition, and there was a little bit of fighting by then by the Poles fighting back, but it was too late. Then Poland disappears from the map. So this country that was one of the largest countries in Europe in 1772 now is gone. And there is no Poland again until 1918, until after World War I. Now, these people, of course, many of whom were not ethnic Poles. That's one reason why this maybe wasn't quite as horrible as it seems. Over in here, a lot of these people were Belarusians and Ukrainians and so on. But the part down here that Austria got is where we have this word Ruthenian that I talked about last time. So some of the Ukrainian people, the westernmost ones, were under the Austro-Hungarian Habsburg Catholic monarchs. You know, some of them were under the Russian Orthodox Russian rule. But I want to go ahead and show this now so you can sort of get a sense of this, because this is now the borders of modern Ukraine, although this is the part, you know, that Putin has had, the Crimea he's had since 2014. The farther west you go, the more you have people who speak Ukrainian. But there are a lot of Russian speakers, particularly in the eastern part. And you see down here in Crimea, the majority of people were ethnically Russian. Now, does that mean they want to be part of Russia and not part of Ukraine? For some of them, at least, it used to. But fewer and fewer of them, particularly younger ones, even the ones for whom Russian is their first language and Ukrainian is kind of a learned language. For example, one of those people is Volodymyr Zelensky. The man has been leading Ukraine. Russian is his native language. I mean, it's his first language. He's comfortable speaking it. Ukrainian is not. So, but because of the savagery of what Putin has done, apparently a whole lot of these people who maybe before had a real mixed feelings about, you know, sort of sense of loyalty to Moscow, you know, because obviously if you're older, you grew up in the Soviet Union, where you did have this time where Ukraine really was just one of the Soviet republics, you know, but, and I was reading, I think in that Atlantic article, actually, an older Ukrainian was saying, you know, it's very hard for some of us to stop thinking in terms of being part of a larger Russian world and being part of Holy Mother Russia, because we were told that so often. And that, you know, some of us do kind of in part agree with Putin saying, you know, this is all part of a larger, what he calls the Ruski Mir, which means the Russian world. But I think, you know, again, if Putin is trying to bring those kind of people into the greater Russian world, he's completely failed. He's had just the opposite effect. He's alienated most people like that because of this, you know, blatant act of aggression. So it was from that perspective, it was certainly a mistake. In terms of religion, about 75% of Ukrainians are at least nominally Orthodox. But if you get over here in the West, I talked last time about the Eastern Rite Catholics, the Uniate Catholics, who, you know, are in communion with Rome. The Pope is their head, but they're not Roman Catholic because they use a different liturgy, and they have some practices like married priests and using leavened bread. So that's where you find some of these. And obviously, the more you're in an area that's Ukrainian speaking and even, you know, Catholic, Eastern Rite Catholic, they're much less inclined to, you know, feel any loyalty towards Moscow. You know, they have really no reason to. And in fact, they were under Austrian rule for a very long time until after World War I, you know, and then they became part of the Russian, you know, the Soviet Union. I think the one area you could argue where maybe the majority of people don't mind being ruled by Putin because they've been ruled by him since, you know, spring of 2014, is the Crimea, which is down here. It is largely ethnically Russian. And in fact, it was part of the Russian Federated Republic. You know, there were 15, in fact, I need to show you this now, I guess. In the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, you know, there were 15 republics, and there's Ukraine. But Crimea was actually under the Russian Republic until 1954, when Khrushchev decided to give it to Ukraine. It's all within the Soviet Union, so in some ways it didn't seem to matter that much then. But it does matter now, obviously, when Putin says, well, basically Khrushchev, you know, should not have done that. He shouldn't have given the Crimea to the Ukrainian Republic. Not to mention, for Putin, Ukraine shouldn't be a separate state anyway. You know? But does that make sense? I mean, I'm going pretty quickly here, but there's a younger Putin there. This is from 1999, leaping ahead from the 18th century to 1999. What happens in the, you know, Russian empires, of course, you have the Communist Revolution. We have two revolutions in 1917. The second one is the Bolshevik Revolution that, you know, sets up this communist government of Lenin, changes the name of this thing to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. On the question of Ukrainian nationalism, there were Ukrainians who in the 19th century began to say, we should have our own state. And you began to have a kind of a resurgence of Ukrainian consciousness and literature and things like this. But the czars obviously tried to crush that completely. They tried to actually make it very difficult for the Ukrainian language to be used. After World War I, there was a brief attempt by Ukraine to go its own way, which was eventually defeated by the communists in Moscow. But what the communists tried to do was to throw a bone to the different nationalities that were not ethnically Russian by creating those republics and saying you have your own sort of government here. They even told them in theory you have the right to secede, although no state ever had, decided to try to do that, at least not until Gorbachev. But the collapse of communism, which, in December of 1991, the different presidents of these republics, including Yeltsin, told Gorbachev, and the key state in some ways was Ukraine. The communist leader of Ukraine, along with Yeltsin, who was the leader of Russia, told Gorbachev, the Soviet Union is now over. We're going our own way. And Gorbachev had been so weakened by things that he couldn't do anything about it. So the state dissolved, largely peacefully at the very end of 1991. But for a lot of people, and certainly Putin has said this more than once, he called it the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. He didn't think the Soviet Union should dissolve. He's not a communist. Whatever else he is, he's not a communist. But he thought it was disastrous because he thought particularly the ethnically Eastern Slavic peoples, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, and the Russians. He definitely thinks they should all should have stayed together. And now that's, in terms of why has he done what he's done in Ukraine, I think he's concerned about his legacy. He's getting up there in years now. I guess he's like 72, 73. And he wants to be the person that kind of recreated the old Russia, at least in terms of, because Belarus really is kind of under his thumb. They have their own president, Lukashenko, who's a Stalinist, basically. But Ukraine, that's the crucial state for this whole vision that Putin has about, the greater Russian world. I don't think he really wants to try to get back the Central Asian republics, they're mainly Turkic language Muslims. I think he has enough of a pragmatist to say, although he does want to have some sort of economic, control over them. Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians, I don't know, they sometimes worry too, because of course they're right next to Russia and very small. But this picture is about, obviously, the question of the church. That's the Patriarch of Moscow, the penultimate, the next to the last one. He became the patriarch in the 80s, I guess. Wait a minute, I think I have his dates on there. Yeah, 1990. No. And he died in 2008. But Alexei was someone once said that Gorbachev failed in terms of what he tried to do, in terms of reforming the Soviet Union, but keeping the Soviet Union alive. If that's what Gorbachev hoped to do, and I think he did, then obviously he failed. But Alexei, this author said, he has succeeded, or he did succeed, because he wanted to bring back a strong Christian Orthodox presence in Russia. And under Yeltsin in the 1990s, that began to happen. Even before Putin, they began opening up the churches again. You started having monasteries and convents again. The Patriarch of Moscow had the ear of Yeltsin to a certain extent. I mean, it's hard to tell just what Yeltsin himself believed, but when he died, a few years after he ceased to be president, because he resigned at the very end of 1999 and let Yeltsin, his successor, take over. But when Yeltsin was buried, he was buried in an Russian Orthodox ceremony, and people point out that was the first Russian ruler to be given a Christian burial since Alexander III, who was Nicholas II's father. He was next to the last Tsar, who died in 1894. Because obviously Nicholas II was murdered by the Bolsheviks and did not get a Christian burial. Although he finally, his remains did get buried under Putin just a few years ago. But Putin claims to have, his mother certainly was a believing Christian. His mother was, but not his father. But he wears his baptismal cross all the time. He supposedly carries a Bible with him on his private plane. He told Time magazine, you can't really have morality without religion. And so he certainly pretends to be very much a practicing Russian Orthodox believer. He doesn't act in a particularly Christian manner, of course, but that's hardly the only ruler in history who was claimed to be a Christian but act in an unchristian manner. But I say Alexei certainly encouraged him in that direction. And I go ahead and talk about this a little bit, less expression on Putin's face. This is a photo from not too long ago, but I think it's the bottom of the list that y'all have, where it says Tikhon Shevkunov. If you see that, I think you probably have more than one version of my list, since I kept sending different versions, but he is probably Putin's dukovnik. And what dukovnik means is like a spiritual advisor. It's like an Russian Orthodox guru, but it's always supposed to be a secret about who's your advisor. And so people have long suspected that this guy is and has been Putin's spiritual advisor, but he says, he kind of gives an ambivalent answer to that when people ask him, that I guess you're not supposed to say. But how much influence he's had on Putin, again, it's kind of hard to say, but this is a guy who definitely believes in the idea of Holy Mother Russia. He definitely believes that the Orthodox Church in Russia has kept the true Orthodoxy, whereas some of the Orthodox churches are moving in too liberal of a direction and so on. And I guess before I go any further with the Putin story, on your list it does say about some things that happened under communism very quickly. The Patriarch of Moscow, the Patriarchate, was restored in 1917, as it says on there, in the midst of all that revolutionary year. But almost immediately, once the Bolsheviks took over, you had a problem with the church being persecuted. And in the 1920s and 30s, particularly, the Russian church was just about annihilated. I mean, they closed the vast majority of churches, dynamited them, turned them into warehouses, certainly destroyed or closed almost all the monasteries. Thousands of Orthodox bishops and monks and nuns and priests were killed. I mean, communism is an explicitly militantly atheist doctrine, and they did try to actually live up to that in the 20s and 30s. But the church didn't completely disappear. And if you notice, it says on there, Sergius, who was the Patriarch of Moscow then, professes absolute loyalty to the Russian Orthodox Church, the Soviet Union, in 1927. So they do have this sad history of being sort of slavishly obedient to who's ever in power, whether it's a czar, but under the Russians, I mean, they were obedient generally to Stalin, at least the upper echelons of the church. There were plenty of brave churchmen who were not. But 1927 is kind of an interesting year, because that's, I'd say, the year when clearly Stalin emerged as the complete dictator of the Soviet Union. But Stalin did do one thing, not out of personal conviction, but during World War II, he began to let up on the Russian Orthodox Church, and they opened up some of the churches, and he starts to appear even with the patriarch some. And it says he re-legalized the Russian Orthodox Church in 1943, which is, of course, right in the middle of World War II. Now, he did that, obviously, just trying to rally the Russian people, because he knew that so many of them still had this attachment to Orthodoxy, at least in a cultural sense. And there's a famous anecdote, and I think he actually said this, that Stalin was watching his soldiers marching out from Moscow at the worst point of that war for them, when the Nazi Germany had got within like 30 miles of Moscow. The Germans almost took Moscow when they invaded in 1941. But he was watching all these Russian soldiers marching out, to die in most cases. But he told this communist next to him, Stalin said, they're not going to fight for me, and they're not going to fight for international socialism. They're going to fight for Holy Mother Russia, he said. And I think he was right. That's why he kind of lets up on the church. Now, he cracked down on it again a little bit after World War II, as he did about a lot of things. But, Stalin dies in 1953. Khrushchev was actually a little more concerned about a strong church than Stalin. And Khrushchev, by any measure, was a more humane ruler, but the church certainly still was under the strict control of the Communist Party. And the upper echelons of the hierarchy were completely infiltrated by KGB agents. I mean, everyone now knows that so many of the people high in the Orthodox Church in Russia were agents of the party and the communist state. It was not a good situation at all. And a lot of people got sort of morally compromised, certainly, by that. But as I said, when the Soviet Union dissolves, December 26, 1991, Yeltsin certainly allowed a great deal of freedom and so on. Putin comes in technically on the last day of 1999 is when he becomes the acting president. And he's been running it, as y'all know, ever since. He had to pretend for a while to be the second command because in the Russian constitution, you have a president, but you also have a prime minister. But in the constitution, you couldn't hold presidency more than 2 straight terms. So for a while, he let his flunky, Medvedev, who had been the prime minister, they just switched positions. But Putin was still the guy very much in control. And now Putin's back as president. He's extended the term of president could be. He's extended in the constitution how many times he can run. I mean, he may well be in power till he dies. He was born in 1952. But he certainly, I think I need to switch to another file for some of the pictures I want to show about this. In terms of dealing with the Orthodox Church, he is, I guess to use the term weaponized because we use that term too much, but he has in some ways weaponized the church, or he's politicized it in terms of his desire to have, this kind of great power status, and that Russia should have, he thinks, an influence beyond just the borders of the Russian state. I'm going to say this one thing really quickly because we were talking about Romanovs and Nicholas II. I think I said last Sunday that Russian Orthodox believers, both in America and in Russia, have now canonized the last Romanovs, Nicholas II, Alexandra, and the 4 daughters, including Anastasia and their son, because they were murdered by communists, obviously. And I think in the church overseas, they actually call them martyrs. I think the church in Russia calls them passion bearers, which is an Orthodox kind of formulation. But they certainly, it's a very popular cult. There's a lot of people now in Russia. It's part of this nostalgia for the old Russia. And plus, a lot of people just have an obsession with monarchy and all, and particularly sort of the tragic end of this family. But icons like this are very common now in Russia. Fascinating story, but there they all are. But one last picture. This is a bit more in the sort of Western Renaissance style, because that generally Orthodox icons are not supposed to be extremely realistic, unlike say Renaissance paintings. They're supposed to look otherworldly, flat and eyes too big and things like this, but no shadows. But this is a little more Western looking. But I'm gonna pop over to this because I think on your list it has Mount Alpha. Yeah, on the last page, if you go down to again where that Tikhon Shevkunov is, but it says Putin visits Mount Athos in 2005 and then in 2016. Does anyone here know what Mount Athos is? Because that's a picture of part of it. Okay, it's a fascinating place. I'll show you on the map where it is. Yeah. It's on a peninsula that's virtually an island because you can see where it's very constricted right there. And you can't cross here. You can really only get there by water, and no women and no even female animals are allowed on Mount Athos now because it's a monastic community. It has about 20 monasteries, but also has these places where hermits live. But it's this place for Orthodox men to retreat from the world, and it's been there for like 1,000 years. It started under the Byzantines. The Ottoman Turkish sultans allowed it to continue. And it's kind of a self-governing, it's full of official titles like the Republic, the Holy Republic of Mount Athos. I mean, technically it's under the jurisdiction of the Greek government now, because that's not modern Greece. But they pretty much do their own thing. And you have monasteries from a lot of different nationalities, including certainly Russians. And they're often very precipitous places, but they have had a revival in some ways, particularly now that Russia is back to being Holy Mother Russia. The largest number of monks on Mount Athos are not Greek. They are actually Russian monks there. And Putin has tried to definitely politicize this place in ways that are very disturbing. And I meant to look this up. I'll try to find it later. But there was a segment on 60 Minutes a few years ago that they ran either on Easter or Christmas. I can't remember which one, but they were trying to throw a bone to Christianity. But they had a thing about Mount Athos, and it was really interesting. So if you can track that down if you want to find out more about it. But Putin tried to go before 2005, but there was like a terrorist attack back in Russia, in 2003. He had to go back. But this is him when he finally got there in 2005. And he has certainly tried, and a lot of his cronies have tried to have more and more contacts in Greece and really controlling Greece. They've bought a lot of properties. You know, they've tried to basically bribe Greek Orthodox churchmen to sort of take their side on things. They generally, particularly before the invasion of Ukraine, a lot of Greeks really had a high opinion of Putin, you know, as kind of an Orthodox believer. And this is the flag of Mount Athos, which is actually the old Byzantine flag. It's interesting, you know, which of course is like what the Russian czars have used. This is him in 2016 when he went back. And that's the current patriarch of Moscow. That's Patriarch Kirill, who's on your list somewhere. Yeah, near the bottom. Well, let's see. I thought there was a patriarch in 2000. Yeah, he's been the patriarch since 2009. He has been very close to Putin. I mean, to put it mildly, not just like in this picture. He has praised Putin to the hilt. He has talked about how he's a man from God. You know, he was sent to save Orthodoxy and all these things. I mean, he's completely in the pocket of Putin. And I think maybe I told you last week that Pope Francis met with Patriarch Kirill in 2022, and apparently told him, he said, you've become Putin's altar boy, you know, and that's a mistake. You know, and Kirill, I'm sure, didn't take it well. But this is a picture of some of the monks there, obviously showing an icon to Putin. And apparently now, again, in that Atlantic article, that it's kind of split the community there, that there used to be this real sense of community on Mount Athos of all these people from these different nationalities. But now the Russian ones tend to go their own way because a lot of the Orthodox world has condemned what, you know, Putin's been doing, particularly in the last few years. And so it's actually split the Holy Republic in a way that it's really never been before, apparently. This is him with another dictator. You probably recognize the now deposed dictator. This is Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria from 2000 until this past December. They were very close. You probably know Russia supported Assad regime. But one thing that Putin said was that Assad was protecting the Christian minorities in Syria. And if he's overthrown, which is what Assad always said, if he's overthrown, you have a Sunni Muslim jihadist group running things, and the Christians will be in a terrible position. And that's what Assad also said. So far, that has not happened with this group that just took over in December. We're still sort of waiting to see. But Putin did things like this. This is from several years ago. They would bring Syrian Christian kids to Russia for like a vacation. You can see they gave them these T-shirts and everything. And those are Russian Orthodox nuns back there, as you probably guess. But they look a little worried, particularly this girl, about, you know, what's exactly going to happen to us when we go to Russia. But, you know, hey, you got a free T-shirt, you know. But anyway, and Putin has often said that, you know, he's promised the Russian Orthodox Church, one of my main agenda items in my international, you know, foreign policy is to defend Christian minorities and all this kind of stuff. And so he certainly cloaked himself with this mantle of defender of particularly Orthodox Christianity in all sorts of ways. But and I wish I could talk about this, about why there's a Russian Orthodox Church in Jerusalem, but that's also about a story I can't get into today. But oops, let me escape from this. Need to go back, I think, to the other file. But in terms of this split within the church, and okay, I see what time it is. Here's a picture of something. Oh yeah, another thing that Putin managed to do, and this all sounds very benign, the Russian Orthodox world was split until 2007 between what was called the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, which was mainly in the United States, that did not recognize all this, you know, communist manipulation control. But after the collapse of communism, you know, Putin was really pushing for the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia to reunite with the one in the United States. And they did in 2007. This is a signing of this agreement. And Kirill came to the United States and so on. And so, you know, obviously this plays into Putin's hands as well. But this is, again, this is before he, you know, went into the Crimea, much less the invasion in 2022. But there's Putin and Kirill. Like I said, they're good buddies. There's an interesting story about how for a while it looked like Kirill was going to be a little bit independent about things, that he was going to be maybe somewhat critical of some things about the government. And he criticized a fairly blatantly corrupt election in Russia, I think in 2011. I want to make sure I get in 2011, 2 years into being patriarch. And almost immediately, the government-controlled websites and things and people online started unleashing all these scandalous stories about Kirill. They were trying to basically blackmail him, intimidate him. And there was stuff they could use because Kirill has a lot of really valuable properties. He, to some extent, some of his family members have actually profited from being at the top of the Orthodox Church. And one thing in particular, bank accounts and all this stuff starts coming out about him. And it's not from like liberal critics of the Russian regime, it's from Putin's people, basically. Like they're basically, reeling him in, yanking his leash. But some of you might know about this. There was this famous, he had this watch, Kirill did, $30,000 French watch that obviously people thought was scandalous. And he tried to claim that he didn't actually have it. But there was a photo of him wearing it where you could see it. And so he and the Russian Orthodox Church released a photo of that event, but they had basically, airbrushed out the watch. You can see the watch to show that, no, I never had that watch. But everyone was laughing when they saw it because you can see a reflection like on the surface of this table. You can see the watch reflected on it. They forgot to, airbrush that part out or whatever, Photoshop it. Anyway, and he finally had to kind of admit, yeah, I did have a $30,000 watch. But the point is, he has not ever said anything critical of the Russian government since then. I mean, he's been just abjectly loyal. So they knew, they knew how to yank his leash. I had to show this picture of him. In terms of reaching out to the outside world, he actually went down, this is a few years ago, to Antarctica, where, there are Russian scientists based there along with a lot of other countries. And I think the only year-round operating church on the continent of Antarctica is a Russian Orthodox church. So I think he made a point of, Putin's holy mother Russia is reaching out. The Russian world goes all the way down there. So there he is with the penguins. And that's that picture I've already shown you with him on the second time he went to Mount Athos with Kirill. But what begins to happen though, and this is one of the main churches in Kiev. This is St. Michael's Monastery. This is another one. This is a monastic church called the Monastery of the Caverns that was built back in like the 1050s. Some people think it's the most significant place in Slavic, Eastern Slavic Russian Orthodoxy. And there's been disputes about the monks there because some of them were sort of pro-Russian, but a lot of them are pro-Ukrainian, and the Ukrainian government has gone in and basically kicked out some of the pro-Russian ones. It's a whole nother dispute I don't want to get into, but there's a picture of it. It's a whole complex, obviously, of buildings in Kiev or Kiev. But this is the Patriarch of Constantinople. This is Bartholomew. And the Patriarchate of Constantinople is often called the ecumenical patriarchate because he is sort of first among equals, is the way the Orthodox world has looked at that. They, said that Rome was wrong when the Patriarch of Rome began to claim to be basically a pope. But they do have a guy who, at least in terms of sort of prestige in a symbolic way, is kind of above the other patriarchs, but he can't really tell them what to do. And so Orthodox would say it's nothing like the Pope. Not to mention that he's in a city, which is, of course, 99% Muslim. There's almost no Greek Orthodox people left in Constantinople. Where they have kind of their version of a Vatican is on your list. It says the Phanar, if you see that, pretty close to the end of the list. And I have the Orthodox Vatican. It's a small little, not even really neighborhood in Istanbul, where the Patriarch of Constantinople, which is of course still the title he has, lives. But they're very much, at the whims of the Turkish government. There are different things that they can't even, if they leave that little area, they can't wear all their vestments and everything. They have to change into kind of ordinary street clothes. There's a big mosque right next door with a big minaret that kind of overshadows it. I mean, in so many ways, if you just talk to a Greek person, they're furious about the way, a lot of things about the Turks, but particularly how they're restricted, how they can't open any kind of new school. And generally the Greeks, who used to be probably 20% of the population of what's now modern Turkey, Anatolia and Constantinople, were Greek Orthodox Christians up until, World War I. But afterwards, they either were killed or driven off or fled, and then there was a population exchange. So what Bartholomew tries to say about it, and there's a picture of him obviously with Francis, is he tries to put a positive spin. He says, because I'm in a city that's not really an Orthodox city, it means I can be a little more international. If I was in like Athens, I would be viewed as mainly the Greek patriarch. If I was, in Russia, certainly. So I can sort of be above it all, be somewhat apolitical and, impartial, he hopes. But he's been an interesting patriarch. I'm trying to think, I think he's in his mid-80s now. Yeah, he was born in 1940. So he's older than Francis. He became the Patriarch of Constantinople in 1991. He's generally been, for an Orthodox leader, pretty liberal. And I say for an Orthodox because Orthodox Church prides itself on not changing. People, they often like to say we're the church that's not afraid not to change, which is why a fair number of American conservatives have been attracted to Orthodox in recent years. I don't know if y'all know about this, but it's a really interesting kind of phenomenon too. But he still wants to change a little bit. And he's been nicknamed the Green Patriarch because he's really interested in environmental issues, if you consider that a liberal issue. He has certainly reached out more to other churches like, the Pope and so on. He's also said that Orthodox Christians really do need to accept evolution, which a lot of them don't want to do, in modern science and things like that. And he's even in a very moderate way, just like Francis, sort of pushed a little bit towards changing attitudes about homosexuality. And that's important because the Patriarch of Moscow says that's a way this guy has sold out Orthodoxy. Because the Russian Orthodox Church is extremely conservative on gender issues, particularly about women, homosexuality, anything. And they make it very much an explicit point. Putin and Kirill both say that this guy is abandoning the true sort of, traditional values of Orthodoxy by being this kind of liberalizer. But what they really don't like about this guy, and there is with some guy who no longer holds up, two old guys, together. Of course, they're two old guys too. But the Ukrainian Orthodox world started asking for Bartholomew to allow them to be separate from Moscow because, in theory, the Orthodox Church in Ukraine was under the Patriarch of Moscow. But increasingly, when Moscow seemed to be so, antithetical to the Ukrainians, they began to ask Bartholomew, let us have our own, independent autocephalous church. And that term autocephaly, I talked about a long time ago. I think it's on the first page, but autocephalous means kind of like self-headed when you really are pretty much autonomous. And the Ukrainian church wanted that. Finally, Bartholomew felt like the Moscow was trying so much to basically usurp his position, and that the Patriarch of Moscow was trying to basically be the leader of the Orthodox world because they said, look, we're the biggest Orthodox country and so on. And finally, there was this meeting that Bartholomew wanted to have of a kind of a pan-Orthodox meeting that they had been planning way back in starting in 1961. And he did all these sort of things to kind of compromise with the Russians and try to placate a lot of their criticism because he really wanted this meeting to happen. And we'll make sure I get the date right about it. Yeah, it was in 2016. And all these different Orthodox churches, it would be the first time in 1,000 years you would have all the different Orthodox churches having a council together. But Russia pulled out a week before it was supposed to happen. And 3 other patriarchs or metropolitans also did. But there are 3 that tend to be pro-Russian, which was the Bulgarian church, the Georgian church, and the Patriarch of Antioch. But that was the final snub that finally really ticked off Bartholomew. So Bartholomew then starts, by 2018, talking about letting Kiev, in Ukraine, have its own autocephalous church. Maybe not a patriarch, but at least a metropolitan who's no longer under the power of Moscow. And when Kirill heard that Bartholomew was thinking about doing this, he flew down to Istanbul in August of 2018 to have a personal meeting with Bartholomew. And it was very acrimonious, apparently, very confrontational, that Kirill said, you cannot let the Ukrainians have their own separate church, that they are part of the Russian world. That's the whole point of what Putin and I are trying to do. And you're going to let them go their own way and go rogue. But Bartholomew said, look, the Ukrainian people have made it clear they want to have their own church, and they want to be, the way he put it was, ecclesiastically independent, the way they are politically independent. But of course, Kirill, I'm sure, is thinking, yeah, but they shouldn't be that either. We're trying to take them back. It's kind of the whole point. And finally, the meeting broke up, and apparently the Russian delegation didn't even hang around for lunch. They just were furious, left, and he flew back to Moscow. But then, and when Kirill dissolved this edict from 1686 that gave Moscow control over the Ukraine, he announced that in October of 2018. Kirill then broke communion with Constantinople, which obviously is splitting like the Orthodox world. He basically said, you know, this guy is now kind of schismatic. He's betrayed true Orthodoxy for all sorts of reasons. He's manipulated by the U.S. and all these other things. And now the Orthodox churches all over the world are having to kind of make a decision. Do we look to Moscow is now sort of the first among equals, you know, as opposed to Constantinople? And some of them do. And of course, Russia spends a lot of money trying to woo these people. And I mean, like Greece is one example where they really are trying to get the Greek Orthodox to go with them and not with Constantinople. But finally, what Bartholomew did after he abolished that edict, but in December of 2018, he recognized the Orthodox Church of Ukraine as a formal church. And in January of 2019, he signed this tomos, it's called, which is like an edict of autocephaly, of being autocephalous. So he has formally taken the stand that they are no longer under, you know, the thumb of Moscow, and that's where it is now. Now, Russia has reacted very badly to it. In 2021, Bartholomew, apparently, he does not like confrontation and splits, and all, tried to kind of reach out to Moscow, but he was completely rebuffed. They don't have anything to do with him now, you know, and certainly this is obviously before the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and now, you know, it's even worse in terms of the acrimony. But I want to leave time for some questions. I've been just talking about that and give you all a chance. So that's kind of where it stands right now. You know, it's a very sad situation, I think, for the Orthodox world. They have never had, obviously, this very centralized unity that the Roman Catholic Church has. Whether that's been a good thing or a bad thing, I think it's been both for them. But right now, the big question facing Orthodox believers is, how much do you want your nation to be your church? Because this kind of sacralization of nationality that Russia has done for a very long time, to be honest, you know, whereas like to be Orthodox means to be Russian. It's something a lot of Orthodox churches have to face. It's a problem the Catholic Church simply doesn't have in the same way. You know, that's one reason why the Catholic Church kept Latin as a liturgical language for everywhere, so you wouldn't have any sense of a national church. But the Orthodox very early on started having, you know, a vernacular Old Church Slavonic and things like that. So it became more decentralized, you know. And of course, the Catholic Church finally went vernacular, but not until 1965. But question, yes.
I just got a question. It sounds as if the reason for Russia invading Ukraine, you know, I just thought it was political and economic, but it sounds like there may be a good portion of it based on the church.
Yes. Well, I'm so glad you asked that, though, because Putin has explicitly said one reason he had the right to invade Ukraine was the Ukrainians had split the church, that they had seceded and tried to have their own Ukrainian church. I mean, he's explicitly said that. Now, I think obviously his reasons are much more than just that. But I think the main, you know, everyone's trying to read his mind. I think what he does want to do is recreate this, what he calls the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. But also Ukraine, it kind of gives the lie to what Putin says. Putin says that Eastern Slavic Orthodox people should not be like the Westerners, that we don't need multi-party liberal democracy. That's not our way. But the Ukrainians are obviously very similar to Russians in language and religion, and yet they have had in the last few years, not a perfect system, but they have had elections where you weren't certain who was going to win, for example, and a relatively free press and all these things right next door. And that's just a model that Putin does not want to see succeed. You know, and so because it gives a lie to this whole idea about, you know, Slavic people, Orthodox Slavs don't need all that. So it's a combination of things. You know, I was surprised that he invaded, to be honest. I didn't think he would, because I thought it's just going to, you know, backfire on him. And of course, he hasn't succeeded. He, you know, he always said, everyone before the invasion, everyone knows that we can be in Kiev in 2 weeks. You know, and now it's been over 2 years. Either thing. But
with the war, they, of course, Crimea is they feel is Russian, but they also mentioned the Donbass.
Donbass, yeah. Let me show you where that is. That's a really good question. Yeah, when he took Crimea, and of course he waited till after the Winter Olympics. Y'all remember the Sochi Winter Olympics 2014, which was, you know, held like right there. But then they essentially invaded, took the Crimea and annexed it. But this is the Donbass. It's the Don River flows right there. And there's a city of Rostov, which I actually attended with some students in 1990 for a couple of weeks. So these are the areas where they've carved out these two separate autonomous republics that have been under Russian control, really since 2014. And they're still under that control. He's tried to add to it, obviously, in here, but that's that region, the Donbass. And again, as you can see, a lot of Russian speakers, it's hard to know just how many people there really wanted that to happen. Like in the Crimea, they actually had, a referendum after he moved in, and it was overwhelmingly yes. And it probably would have been largely yes, I think, but who knows now. But that's the Donbass right there. That's a good question. Yeah, when y'all ask questions, it always makes me remember things I should have said. But anything else? I hope this is making some sense. I mean, it's a very tragic story. It's a fascinating story, though. Obviously, as an historian, I was trying to revive this kind of czarist Holy Mother Russia past, that Putin has been doing. How much I do think it's in some ways the Russian church has had a genuine spiritual resurgence in the last few decades, but the more their leadership is doing this kind of Caesaro-Papist, obsequious kind of slavish following, it's just discrediting Christianity, I'm sure, the church in the minds of particularly younger people. And someone asked about, the great majority of Russians now identify as Russian Orthodox, but very few of them are regular churchgoers. There's a much higher church attendance in Ukraine, actually, among the Orthodox there. And I think Bartholomew even pointed that out to Carol in their little meeting. But well, I mean, I need to let you go because it's 10:16, but I'm glad y'all were able to come, and I hope this has made sense to some extent.
Dr. Echerd, thank you so much for leading us this month. It's been a subject that I was not informed of and feel much more informed now. So, and thank you for all of the visual presentations that you bring, the maps, the images. It just adds so much to the.
Well, yeah, it doesn't make sense at all if you don't have them now. Yeah, my students would not put up with the lack of images, that's for sure.
We want to thank David Lowe and Andy Morris and the property management team for setting up our room this month. And this is a room that's not usually used on Sunday mornings. And so it's extra work, extra effort for some people to set it up and get coffee ready for us and run the technology and make it available to people at other places in the building and at home or maybe away from home who could not participate. They are able to participate by the Zoom that Andy has managed for us these weeks. It's the custom of the Ages and Stages class to make a small token honorarium contribution to in honor of our guest hosts, speakers. And so we'll be doing that to the Harpeth Hall Fund for continuing education of faculty in your honor, and we will be making that contribution. Next week, classes will be back in their regular classroom unless your class communicator tells you otherwise. So let's dismiss with wish for a safe, productive week this week. Go in peace and be in your regular classrooms next week.